Warpugs, we have finally caught up to episode 13 of the Siege of Vraks by Janovich. We are at Marshal Kargori's offensive. Now, so far, this has been nothing but outstanding. This has been nothing but informative. If you were looking for a series to introduce someone, especially history buffs, to Krieg, you really couldn't find a better series to really put in front of them at this point, I think, that would explain the Siege of Vraks in such a way that it's easy to get a hold of, it's easy to watch. Of course, you got his wonderful voice that narrates this stuff. This has been a delight to watch. This has been a delight to be a part of. And I'm glad you guys requested this. And I'm glad you guys recommended him to me in the first place, because without you, I never would have seen anything by him. So, what we're going to do is we're going to finish this. We're going to round everything up nice and tight. And then we're going to wait, because there's more coming. Warpugs, head over to Janovich's channel. Subscribe. If you haven't subscribed to me yet, why not? You make me cry. But for now, Siege of Vraks, episode 13. I hit this button, and let's go. Oh, it's lovely.
Hello everyone, just a quick word before the start of this video. As you may know, I have been developing a strategy World War I board game, and it's reaching the final stages. I am planning to kickstart it at the start of next year, and if you're interested in keeping up with the development, I would advise you to head over to my Discord server. Here you can assign yourself the Iron Resolve board game role. This gives you access to the Iron Resolve updates and a channel to discuss the board game. If you want to know more, you can check out my shorts videos where I explain it in more detail. And now, let's get on with the video.
Sorry guys, I'm coughing a good little deal. In the Emperor's service, the Death Cult will pay any price. Yes.
The Imperial Navy was once again in firm control of the space around Vraks. The Sword-class frigates had searched the system to hunt down the damaged Anarchy's heart, but there was no trace of the ancient Chaos battleship to be found. Convoys of Imperial cargo ships could now safely traverse the sector and deliver a near-endless stream of supplies to the planet. On the surface below, fresh troops and equipment steadily flowed into the front lines. As the newly arrived manpower took their place in the regiments, the 88th Siege Army regained its former fighting spirit. The veteran guardsmen could finally enjoy some well-earned rest, and the horrors of the last 12 months now seemed like a passing fever dream. There were finally enough replacement parts for the worn-out weapons and vehicles to be properly repaired.
And now there's new fresh horrors! Yay!
With the influx of new uniforms, plenty of food, ammunition, building materials, and fuel, the army was in better shape than ever before. For over a year, the Chaos forces had enjoyed complete air superiority in the skies above Vraks. Although the portable void shield generators had been hugely important in protecting the 88th Siege Army's logistics against bombing raids, there was not much they could do to challenge the enemy harassment from above. But the arrival of extra anti-air defenses now granted the Imperial troops the opportunity to fight back. No longer would the enemy fighters have the luxury of carelessly flying wherever they pleased.
Nice.
Any Vraxian pilot with the temerity to strafe a trench line would henceforth be met by a hail of flak. And
Very
that was not
nice.
all. The Imperial Navy had brought their own aerial troops. Wherever formations of enemy air squadrons dared to venture too far from the citadel, they would be met by Imperial Navy fighter planes deployed from the ships in orbit. The skies above Vraks were now the site of intense dogfights between the pilots of the 717th Navy Fighter Wing and Chaos Hellblades. These were costly engagements for both sides, but due to the Imperium's unwavering commitment, the heretical aircraft were often forced to retreat back to the safety of their own anti-air defense network.
Very nice.
All in all, the supply lines of Vraks were running as smooth and uninterrupted as could realistically be expected. The Munitorum Labor Corps was already working hard to construct aircraft landing strips to further increase the 717th Fighter Wing capacity, and over time, it was expected that the Imperium should be able to gain complete air superiority.
Now, that in and of itself, like, you got to remember, they can't fly anything over the Citadel. The Citadel has way too much air defense for that. So he's mainly talking about the area outside the walls.
As soon as the skies were cleared out, the Marauder bombers would be able to perform their bombing campaigns against key targets in the Vraxian defenses.
Okay,
the Titans
never mind,
of Legio
sorry.
Restorum had finished their long march over the Saratama Plains and now waited patiently behind the front lines for the right moment to strike. The Mechanicus forces would remain a separate force under their own command structure, not beholden to the orders of Amam Kargori. High Princeps Rand Droka had her own priorities. She was solely focused on destroying the traitors of Legio Volcanum, but she was willing to work with the Imperial Commander and support his campaign plans. After all, the cooperation was of mutual benefit.
Yes.
Having access to the supportive firepower of disciplined Death Corps artillery gunners in order to suppress the enemy Titan's void shields was an advantage that she did not overlook. For now, the Death Corps engineers would be distributed and attached to the Line Corps in a supporting role. Although Kargori had requested their assistance on Vraks in an offensive capacity, it would take some preparations before they were ready to be deployed in combat.
Yeah.
They had come to Vraks with specialized digging equipment, which would allow them to wage an underground war in order to undermine the enemy's front lines and potentially even break into the vast network of Vraxian storage facilities. The digging of trenches in the loose Vraxian soil had been relatively straightforward.
Now, here's the thing about Death Corps engineers. Death Corps engineers, pretty much when you're Death Corps infantry, you look upon the Death Riders with a certain amount of mysticism, but the engineers are the really crazy ones because they dig the tunnels while your artillery bombarding the ground above them. Yeah, I know.
But deep operations would be of a more complex nature. With the vast amount of rainstorms on Vraks, flooding and the consequential collapse of tunnels was a significant risk. In order to reach a substratum sturdy enough, the Death Corps engineers would have to dig deep, which would bring a plethora of different challenges. The infrastructure to bring large amounts of men, equipment, oxygen, electricity, and fuel deep underground would have to be built. And so, before this task could begin, they would first have to research the best locations and methods to perform these operations. In order to avoid detection, the mine entrances would have to be positioned far behind the front line, and so it would take time before the tunnels could reach the enemy lines. And so, the engineers diligently and patiently began digging. In the meantime, Kargori would...
I am a dwarf. Okay, I didn't mean to... No, I should shut up.
...endeavor to reclaim lost ground. The start of his campaign plan relied upon, once again, completely encircling the Vraxian inner defensive line. In order to achieve this, he took note from the plans of his predecessor, Lord Commander Julka. In traditional fashion, Kargori simply ordered the start of another massive bombardment campaign against the enemy defenses. All along the front, the Imperial cannons opened fire, raining down a storm of shells upon the Vraxian trenches. The bombardment would not nearly reach the same heights as during Julka's big push, but the blunt approach should not be underestimated.
No.
The bombardment had plenty of effect in its own right, and the Vraxians were not at all too pleased to be on the receiving end of a massive bombardment once again. And so, in an attempt to hinder their foe, the Vraxian artillery gunners responded in kind. But against the combined guns of the 88th Siege Army, the counter-battery fire would have limited effect. The Vraxian defenders in the front lines would have to endure an endless barrage for several days. Kargori was well aware of the Death Corps' reputation for sacrifice. After a year of passivity, the soldiers would be eager to charge and would not appreciate being held back. The new commander was determined to make a good first impression on the soldiers from Krieg. Once the artillery had done its job, he would order every single infantry regiment to advance over no man's land. So far, it would not appear as if the Marshal possessed any more military finesse than his predecessor.
True.
But we should not forget that Amam Kargori was an experienced commander with many successful campaigns under his belt. His additional orders would prove to make all the difference. He had requested Legio Astorum to support the 12th Line Corps assault in Sector 54-46. This show of force would surely draw in a vast amount of enemy armored support units to halt them.
Yep.
Once the Vraksians had committed their tanks to the battle, Kargori would send in his Imperial Navy fighters to wreak havoc on their formations and hopefully pin them down. Supported by tanks, the Titans would then attempt to advance even further into enemy territory and threaten to breach through the enemy lines.
This is the difference between somebody who's just sitting back and literally just trying to throw a minute at the problem until it goes away, and somebody who's actually thinking about what he's doing, using tactics.
But this was actually not to be Kargori's main objective. He suspected that the forward Titan would draw the attention of Legio Vulcanum. The enemy god machines would inevitably march out to meet Legio Astorum in battle and fight for supremacy over the Van Miersland wastes. As tempting as relying on the potential breakthrough may be, Kargori wasn't foolish enough to commit the bulk of his forces right in the maelstrom of a Titan battleground.
That would be a bad idea.
Instead, he figured that as long as the enemy Titans were kept busy near Sector 54-46, the 30th and 1st Line Corps would be granted the opportunity to advance in the east. With the support of the Assault Corps, they would be able to push the enemy back towards the inner defensive line and complete the planned encirclement. As always, the battle was expected to take a high price for every mile of ground. But with the supply lines restored, the Death Corps once again held the advantage in the long, drawn-out war of attrition. This would be the first time that complex combined arms offenses were about to be performed on Vraks. Infantry, tanks, artillery, aircraft, and Titans would have to work closely
It's a beautiful thing, guys. It's a beautiful thing.
together to see this plan succeed. In Sector 54-46, Captain Trian of the 143rd Regiment was ready to charge out of the trenches. He had noticed the mighty god machines of Legio Astorum muster behind his lines, and so he realized this part of the front had been chosen for a special engagement. As the final shells of the bombardment flew overhead and landed in the Vraksian trenches, the order to attack was given. All along the front lines, the Death Corps infantry climbed out of their trenches and marched towards their enemy. The 88th was finally on the offensive again.
Yep.
A feeling of excitement was in the air. But the glorious moment...
I'm so excited. And I just... Okay, I apologize. It's late. I'm sorry.
of the charge wouldn't be enjoyed for long. Soon, the Vraksian guns opened fire into their ranks, and the siege was back to its usual grinding combat. Waves upon waves of infantry were mowed down or got stuck in no man's land. Here and there, groups of soldiers managed to get into the enemy trenches, only to be repelled by counterattacks. For the first few hours, it seemed that the battle was fought in the same old way, with the same old results. But with the assistance of the Titans, on the 12th Line Corps' front, the attack was proceeding well. The God Machine's overwhelming firepower crushed bunkers and gun emplacements left and right, smashing a path for Captain Trian and his men to advance. The Vraksians' artillery fire clashed harmlessly into the Titans' void shield generators, and the defenders realized they would need more firepower. As Kargori had expected, the Vraksian heavy tanks were called in for support. From the high ground, the Death Corps commanders observed the terrain through their magnoculars and soon spotted columns of dust on the horizon, thrown up by the tracks of the armored reinforcements. They relayed the coordinates to command of the 717th Navy Fighter Wing, who launched numerous thunderbolts to the skies in order to harass the advancing enemy tanks. As the squadrons moved in for the kill, the anti-air defenses took a heavy toll on them, but the important mission continued regardless. They dropped their bombs strategically, making sure to disable the vehicles in the front and rear of the columns in order to immobilize their formation. Once the formation was brought to a halt, it would be like shooting fish in a barrel. Unfortunately, the enemy air force responded quickly, and Hellblades arrived onto the scene much sooner than expected. As the air filled with streams of bullets, many pilots were forced into dogfights in a bid for survival. As the battle continued, the Thunderbolts were taking too many losses and were eventually ordered to turn back. But a lot of the damage had already been done. The enemy armored reinforcement had been stopped dead in their tracks. Before they would be on the move again, roads would have to be cleared. The heretical tank regiments would require time to reorganize, and many vehicles were in need of repairs. The costly mission had been a success.
whenever you're dealing with a convoy, it's always best to take out the front and the back. That way, there's really nowhere to move. And it basically creates a massive clog. You've seen this in the Ukraine against Russia.
Although many of the reinforcements would eventually continue on their way towards the front, the delays and damage would give the Titans valuable time to continue their advance uncontested. High in the skies, the pilots had been granted a good vision of the Vraksian inner defensive line, and upon returning, they were debriefed for intel. But to the dismay of High Command, the situation was worse than had been anticipated. During the relative inactivity of the previous year, the defenders had found time to continue fortifying the entire area between the inner defensive line and the citadel, and had turned it into a giant kill zone.
We need to take out... Yeah. Because this place, more than anything else, deserved a couple of macro cannon rounds. I'm just saying.
As if the 7-kilometer deep defensive lines hadn't been enough, now the entire rear area had been integrated into the defenses. The terrain was now completely scattered with trenches, bunkers, and minefields. Even if a breakthrough of the inner defensive line occurred, the Vraksians could continue their resistance as effectively as before. On a strategic level, the distinction between the defensive line and the rear areas had become essentially meaningless. Whereas before, most of the 88th Siege Army success had relied upon cracking the defensive lines and rolling up the rear, this would no longer work. The infantry would have to fight for every inch of ground. But as formidable as the defenses may be, they were still no match for Titans. In the face of the Imperial God Machines continuing their rampage in the front lines, Vraksian High Command desperately pleaded with Legio Vulcanum to move in to intercept. As always, communication between Chaos forces had been severely lacking, and the request proved to be unnecessary. As soon they had become aware that Legio Astorum had amassed near Sector 54-46, the traitor Titans had already marched against the loyalists of their own accord. As soon as they arrived, the Titans clashed and the intensity of the fight increased tenfold. Long-distance lasers flashed over the battlefield. Void shields sparked and flared under the high-energy impacts of the massive weapons. Undeterred by their opponent's display of force, both sides continued marching forward. Soon, the legions were fully engaged with neither side holding anything back. Volcano cannons scorched the earth passed over the heads of the ground troops. Volleys of rockets were fired and impacted with devastating results. Any infantry and tanks caught in the crossfire were doomed to perish. Legio Vulcanum was slightly outnumbered against the 22 Imperial Titans, which put them at a disadvantage.
The sheer fact of the matter is, if you're a regular human on the ground in a Titan fight, your life is so worthless at that point, it just beggars belief. Like, you could die from overpressure alone from something firing a weapon 50 meters ahead of you. That's how insane the weapons on Titans are.
But the devious traitors had fought side by side with War Master Horus during the heresy, and their renowned legion was not to be underestimated. A Reaver Titan by the name of Invigila Alpha moved forward, firing his Gatling guns, its blazing hot barrels sending hundreds of rounds against the traitors every few seconds. But during its daring advance, it had carelessly moved out of position. Legio Vulcanum would not let this opportunity go to waste, and turned their combined firepower upon the Reaver. Soon its void shields were overloaded by concentrated bursts of several Vulcan megabolters. Before the tech priests and servitors could get them back online, a direct hit by a volcano cannon against its command bridge proved fatal. The superheated blast melted straight through its armor and eliminated its crew. The Titan seized, standing motionless and disabled. Here the husk would remain standing for the remainder of the war, slowly rusting away on the Van Meerslen wastes.
That is a sad tale. That is a sad tale. I wonder if on some of these planets where the Horus Heresy was fought, that they're ever going to include a story of them running across the wreckage of that particular battle. Now, I know they did the one about Isfahan 3, but I would love to see yet another battlefield around that. I really would. Sorry about that. I had to get up for a second. Let's get back into this.
Attested that Legio Vulcanum had scored first blood. The Titan battle would continue for several days. The apocalyptic intensity of the clash halting the ground troops from achieving further progress on this part of the front. Meanwhile, with the enemy Titans occupied in the west, the 30th and 1st Line Corps wasted no time with their advance in the east. Tanks had gathered en masse and were ready to roll forward in support of the infantry. The fast-moving vehicles would play a crucial role in securing their northern flank and enveloping the enemy forces.
Yes.
Together, the troops of the 30th Line Corps and Assault Corps would swing around the flank of the 1st Line Corps in their attempt to close the gap around the inner defensive line. Their attack first ran into the entrenched Chaos Militia, holding up in the remnants of the 2nd defensive line. These ragtag bands of troops had apparently not spent any time repairing or improving the defenses they were occupying. The bunkers and trenches had been designed to face outwards, and it did not take the Death Corps soldiers long to force them to abandon these positions. The first part of the assault proceeded better than expected. Large groups of renegade militia now moved over the plains in order to escape the Death Corps' advance. The Vraksian defenders, still holding the long-neglected eastern defensive line, could see the writing on the wall. If nothing was done, they would soon find themselves isolated from the rest of their army again. They had held their secluded position for the entirety of the war, patiently waiting for either new orders or the 88th Siege Army to attack their lines, but over the many years neither had come. With the likelihood of being cut off a second time and missing out on the war, they decided to act on their own accord. And so, after more than a decade of inactivity, the Vraksians finally abandoned the eastern defensive and joined the retreating Chaos Militia troops back towards the inner defensive line, where they...
I'd say 10 years without orders is well enough of time for you to sit there and make your own decisions at that point. 10 days without orders is kind of really pushing it. 10 weeks? Yeah. 10 months? 10 years? I'm sorry, at that point, we've got some major leadership issues to discuss.
Could continue the fight. Meanwhile, the 1st Line Corps had a more difficult time. Their part of the plan was being held up by organized Chaos Space Marine warbands. These superhuman warriors would not be pushed back so easily. Despite the 1st Line Corps' best efforts, the traitor Astartes would not budge, and their advance was ground to a halt. The slaughter of the 19th Regiment at the hand of the Nurgle worshippers and the notorious TP3 gas had not been forgotten.
No.
The Death Corps' commandos figured that some
Yes,
corrosive
avenge
toxins
Hans.
of their own would be the perfect retaliation, and the deployment of poison gas may force the Astartes out of their comfortable positions. Seeing his overall campaign plans thwarted by the Chaos Warbands, Marshal Kargori gave permission to perform a large-scale gas attack on the eastern front. Soon, large streams of poison steadily crawled towards the enemy, once again enveloping the eastern front into a thick, green, deadly cloud. Although this new gas would not match the corrosive aspects of the TP3, the Death Corps made sure to overcompensate and completely soak the area. The density of the gas was so thick that indeed many of the Chaos Warbands figured it was to their best interest to abandon the region.
When the gas is so thick that people that associate with Nurgle worshippers don't want to be around you.
But the gas attack had played right into the Nurgle worshippers' hands. Although the other warbands had been forced to retreat, the Lords of Decay saw little reason to leave. In fact, this had been exactly what they had been waiting for. With the blessing of Father Nurgle, their undead, rotting bodies could withstand these conditions just fine. Steadily, the area was turning into a sludgy, toxic swamp, permanently soaked in a green mist. The 88th Siege Army had
nasty.
unwittingly assisted the Lords of Decay in transforming this area into the perfect base of operation for the followers of Nurgle. The
Perfect.
retreating Vraksian and Renegade infantry now found themselves in trouble, caught between the advancing Imperial onslaught to the north and the untraversable Demas Trench to their rear. They had nowhere to go but through the uninviting Nurgle swamplands. Those lucky enough...
And now you're... Yeah, it's gonna be like that for you guys. Have fun. You deserve it.
to be equipped with respirator devices strapped on their gas masks, had continued their retreat into the thick green mists. The unfortunate bastards who did not have these would have to make do with more improvised solutions, like holding chemically soaked cloths in front of their faces. But eventually, they too would take their chances and began marching into the swamps. Despite their flanks being protected by those unbudgeable Lords of Decay, it would remain to be seen how many of the infantry would safely make it back to the inner defensive line. For now, the assault halted, and the troops prepared for the next stage of the assault. Once the worst of the gas had dissipated, the attack would continue. If anyone had managed to withstand the thick green clouds, They would soon face the combined force of the 1st and 30th Line Corps.
Yay.
Until that time, a gap on the eastern front would remain, preventing the inner defensive line from being completely surrounded. Back on the Van Meersland wastes, the Titan battle was finally reaching its end. After 5 days of back and forth, both sides were running out of ammunition. Their crews were exhausted and in dire need of rest. Legia Volcanum was the first to withdraw from battle, leaving the Imperial troops to claim a Pyrrhic victory. The battle had been costly. 7 Warhounds and 4 Reaver Titans had been destroyed by the traitors. These would eventually have to be replaced and sent in from their Forge World Lucius to bring the battle group back to its original strength. Princeps Randadroka's leading Reaver Titan by the name of Praetorian was still standing. A tally of victims had been added to her honor banner. All in all, it was estimated that a dozen or so Chaos Titans had been destroyed in total, but the battle was not over.
No.
Yet more Chaos Titans would have to be hunted down and destroyed before Legio Astorum's task on Vraks was complete. Supported by tanks and infantry, the remaining Titans prepared to continue pushing forward towards the Citadel. The Vraxians expected to halt this advance were in a hopeless situation.
It's always fun when you get to break out the big guns, and the people that had the big guns before you don't have them anymore.
The earlier battle, one of the Imperial Warhounds had been brought down by the combined efforts of several artillery batteries, but this was their only success. Overall, there was not much the defenders could do to harm these god machines, especially now that the Chaos Titans had abandoned the field of battle. Legio Astorum once more aimed their weapons directly against the hunkered-down Vraxian defenders. Upon witnessing the incredible damage wrought upon their fortifications, many Vraxians suffered Titan shock and lost their will to fight. Those who found themselves in a Titan's path of destruction were struck with panic and fled their bunkers and trenches. Together with the Titans, the 12th Line Corps managed to push far into the enemy's defenses, all the way towards the Curtain Wall.
Yes.
Although not nearly as large and well fortified as the defensive lines, the Curtain Wall was a formidable structure in its own right that surrounded the citadel on all sides. Its well-protected reinforced gates would prove difficult to breach even for the Titans. This would be a fight for another day. And so, Princeps Randroka ordered the battle group to halt just outside range of the Curtain Wall's main guns. A large stride had been made towards victory, and the Kargori offensive would be considered a success. But the new commander was well aware that the Titans' unwavering commitment and battle prowess had won him this battle.
Yes.
And it would not be wise to push forward without their support. Before the campaign could continue in earnest, they would need to replenish their munitions and rest. Having done more than could be expected of them, Legio Astorum retreated back to the rear of the line where their Titans would be stationed inside large protected silos to undergo repair and maintenance by the Mechanicus ordnancers. While the army was recovering from the Kargori offensive, the engineers continued digging their tunnels towards their front lines. Their activity had still gone unnoticed by the Vraxian defenders, and an underground network had reached all the way under the inner defensive line. With any luck, they would breach the first Vraxian storage depots. Then the underground war could truly begin. Soon, it would be time for the engineers to prove that Marshal Kargori had been right in bringing their expertise to Vraks.
Two jobs I would never want in the Imperium. Two, at the very least. One, I would not want to be an engineer for the Deathcrow Krieg. And two, I would not want to be a Death Rider for the Deathcrow Krieg. Simply because, oh my god, we're just not even going there as far as how messed up that would be. It would screw you up. Like, your death rate is astronomical. And if you're an engineer, you're underground playing Diggy Diggy Hole the entire time. I'm just saying, if you're not ready for that kind of life, you don't want that kind of life. Warpugs, we will wait patiently for episode 14 of this series to come out. But until then, check the description box, subscribe to Janovich, subscribe to me, and I'll catch you guys next time. Oh my god.